So I guess we might as well get started. The topic of cornices is something that everybody's got one, or most everybody's got one, and they don't know what to do with them. They don't even think, it's just like something that's there. It's like the sky, and somebody says, well, the sky's made up of, different kinds of clouds, and people say, oh yeah? What do you mean, different kind of, well, there's different styles. It's like fingerprints, that they all look the same until you start really spending time and looking at them. I get this all the time of people say, well, a cornice is a cornice. And we would say, well, how big's your cornice? What's the height? What's the projection? What's the style? What's the material? And they go, there's a difference? They don't know. So, yes, sir.
Charlie, would you introduce yourself?
That's a great idea. Let me look at my card. I'm Charlie Wittman, and my company is called Fiberglass Corporation. We make things that look like other things in fiberglass. And we've been making architectural ornamentation since the early 60s. There have been materials that we've done that now have been up on buildings for well over 50 years, which is hard to believe that it goes by that quick. The history of my company is that previously my father was in the fiberglass business in the 40s, making aircraft parts, and I took over the business in the 60s, and we were looking around to see what it is that we're going to end up doing, and we realized that that we had all these molds that we were making these cornices, and I said, it's what I'm really interested in anyway. If I were to do it over again, I might have become an architect. So we've been specializing in exterior ornamentation and cornices in particular now for quite a number of decades, and around the metropolitan New York area, we've put up somewhere between 25 and 30 miles of fiberglass cornices, which is kind of a pretty big number. And my wife always says, well, where's the money? You got so many miles of stuff. In the course of doing all of this stuff, I end up climbing around on buildings, and I've made it kind of my vocation and my avocation to know what is going on in and around and amongst behind cornices. And the thing that I think is always interesting to know, and actually critical to know, when you're dealing with a building that, especially in a historic district, that you have stuff that's 100 years old or more, and it's failing or it's gone, the critical question is to find out, well, why is it failing, or why did it fail, or why did they take it off? Because it's pretty obvious that nobody removes something if it's not bad, if it hasn't failed, and even though they might have removed it 40 years ago, well, what was the problem? And quite often it revolves around maintenance, deferred maintenance, or lack of maintenance, and lack of attention to waterproofing. So whether your cornice was made of wood, sheet metal, terracotta, limestone, cast iron, cream cheese, it's all subject to water infiltration, and the actual ornamental material in many cases hasn't failed, but the support method has failed. But if you look at like old tin cornices, and if you look inside of them, they're really held together with sticks and twigs. You'd be just shocked at how meager the support structure is behind these old cornices. But the way that they were set they really weren't taking any load because the load was carried by an extension of the roof. But they all relied on the integrity of the waterproofing of the roof that went above it, or in the case of masonry cornices, the condition of the parapet cap quite often dictated whether you got water coming down inside the building. So that the forensic investigation will show that what's inside of what looks like fine materials is frighteningly deficient or non-existent. I was talking to Susan Tunick before, who was from the Friends of Terracotta and one of the prime advocates of the terracotta architectural elements. And the fact is that the water has corroded the steel that's holding these very heavy elements to the point where it's, in many cases, gone. That a lot of the huge ornamental elements are held up literally by gravity of the weight of the stone above is holding this thing. And if we had earthquakes here, we'd have a lot of stuff in the streets. So So the first thing that to think about is, you know, why do we have cornices? You know, is it just an affectation? Is it somebody's desire to have a big crown on top of their monumental building? But in reality, the cornice does or did serve a functional purpose. It helps to shed the water away from the building and create a termination of the architectural element of the building. There's, you know, if you go back to the Greek and Roman orders, you know, there's whole repeating patterns on a building. The cornice is a major part of that whole design. And actually, the real reason that there are cornices on old buildings is so that I'll have work to do. So the first thing that I think is important when you have an old building is to understand what your cornice was made of. And if it is failing, why did it fail? And that all is something that would require either a competent exterior restoration company or you know, a qualified architect, because there are architects who can design stuff, and then there's architects who know what's behind old buildings. And not all architects have any idea about what's inside or structurally happening behind old buildings, behind the facade of old buildings, or inside them, I should say. So as I mentioned before, you know, the maintenance is the key element from the past, but we can't go backward in time. So that when replacing an old cornice, I think the first responsible thing to do is to look at the roof of the building and make sure that you're not making a repair and not addressing the cause of the problem. So that goes without saying, is that you can't just stick a Band-Aid on the front and not deal with the structural wound. So some of the modes of failure, and by the way, if anybody has any questions as I'm rattling along here, just please feel free. So you have, you know, roof failure. The joints on masonry structures might not have been dealt with properly, so you have water coming in through the joints. There may have been fire damage at some point, perhaps in the distant past that they don't know about. With tin cornices, if you have a fire on the east end of the building, quite often the fire will go up inside the old cornice, and you might have some failure, some fire damage 20, 30, 40 feet away that was, didn't, the fire might have gone out, but the structure inside might have failed, and you have a failure later on in life. The birds get into old cornices, and we've seen literally a ton of guano inside of these old cornices, because the birds and squirrels and critters love to hang out in there. So once you do an existing conditions survey and you find out what you have, one of the things that you'll most often find behind wood and sheet metal cornices is that the parapet wall is kind of a rudimentary stack of stones. It's not a structural parapet as such, because it's basically enclosed inside of the cornice unit. This is, oh, I can write on here. Can I write on this?
On the side.
Oh.
Just pull it up. It should just go up. Charlie, just go to the side.
Cornices typically slant down when they prior to the roof?
This is the back. So this is the front. So typically on a sheet metal cornice, this is what's called a haunch. And so this is a wood structure that's tied down into the roofing, and it's bearing on the parapet wall, and they might have some struts occasionally holding it up. But this parapet wall is just in compression at the very most. It has no structural integrity in terms of something hanging on it. So quite often, when they take off the old cornice, they'll just parge this up with nice stucco or something. Sometimes they'll add, because this might be not high enough, so they might add some brick to get to the 3.5 foot parapet height. And there you have a parapet wall. So a lot of the buildings where cornices have been removed 20, 30, 40 years ago, and they have a nice sort of a stucco finish on top. You see this in Brooklyn. It's all over the city you see that. And they say, okay, give us a cornice. Well, if you go up there and really push on this wall, you could push these walls over, because there's no reinforcing rods inside this. When they take off an old cornice, this wall is quite often just made up of common brick with lime mortar that's washed out. And sometimes on really old buildings, you'll see that this parapet wall inside is just dunnage. And I've seen old bottles and paving stones. I call it the first expression of urban waste management, because construction site debris, they didn't throw it away. They just put it up and built like a Yankee stone fence up here, and they built the cornice around it. The other thing is that the sheet metal cornices, especially, the face brick of the building, the mason was on a scaffold out here and doing a nice brick job. But then they get to the top here, and they take this sheet metal cornice, and let's say this is the top of the face brick. The sheet metal cornice would sit upon the parapet wall. They had some wire ties, and they had this roof haunch that they tied it to, and now the mason is standing on this side, building the wall. So the outside of this parapet wall was never ever meant to be exposed. They never intended it to be exposed to the weather or to be at all decorative. So when they take a cornice off, you look at it and say, my God, I always thought that the masons in the 1800s were, the most skilled craftsmen in the world. What did they do? They have a blind mason that put this up? Because you're looking at the backside. The guy was building this overhand so that all the snots of the mortar are sticking through. Bricks are all helter-skelter. What I always tell people is take it right down to the face brick, build a new parapet wall. You can't save any money, and it's not structural for any purpose, and it's probably more part of the problem than the cure. So, and this is consistent with wood cornices and sheet metal cornices. Sometimes also cast iron cornices have the same condition, where they have structure and the parapet walls inside are really kind of nasty looking. With masonry and terracotta cornices, the masonry units are really part of the wall. It's a different kind of a condition, in which case you have structural steel members sitting inside, and they have steel outriggers and hangers, so that it's more of a structural assembly that when it's taken apart, it comes apart in different ways. And when we run across masonry cornices, especially terracotta ones, the steel quite often is compromised in the extension portion, but the part that goes back into the wall and into the spandrel is, while not strong enough to be able to support a new terracotta element, in many cases is strong enough to support a lightweight replacement material. So that if you were going to rebuild the structure in masonry, in terracotta or even GFRC or cast stone, you would have to remove the whole parapet, remove the spandrels, rebuild the whole structure, and then support the new cornice from it. With lightweight replacement materials, this all most cases can remain, and it can be supported without having to do all that demolition, which is a considerable cost implication on a job.
Charlie, you
Yes.
drew a figure on the roof for the cornice installation, which in this case you're describing wood or sheet metal. For terracotta and masonry cornice,
It would be different.
Do you need to be on the scaffolding? Do you need hanging scaffolding or stage scaffolding?
I kind of like pipe scaffolding.
So you're working from the front with those materials?
Yes, because they're replacing it in fiberglass. It's an exterior element. With real terracotta, it's a masonry unit, but I think that's still prudent to have a pipe scaffold. Yes.
If you have a landmark building with tin metal cornice, can you replace it with fiberglass? You need to get permission?
Oh, you need to get permission no matter what you do, and you have to always make sure. Gesundheit. You always should make sure that you follow the landmark procedure. I would say that all of the terrible landmark stories and bitching and moaning that you hear from building owners quite often comes back to the fact that they didn't follow the steps and get the proper landmark approval all the way along. Even though it's a pain, it's painful, it's tedious, it's unpredictable, It all depends on who your landmarks person is, and whether they stay at the commission through your job, because you could get 2/3 of the way through and all of a sudden you have another person, and that may be either better or worse. It's hard to say. They don't always follow precedent, so that your next door neighbor could have done something and you say, I want to do what they did. And they say, well, no, you're number 472, that's 474, a whole new. So yes, you have to get permission. You should not bypass them, because at the end of your job, if you don't do it, they can always come by and say, hey, what'd you do? And then then you got other problems. And what happens sometimes when somebody does go out of the procedure, the building gets like a nasty name at the commission. And so the next owner might want to do something. They say, that building, and you should always consult with them. Yeah.
I thought it would be interesting to compare the cost and the weight differences of fiberglass with some other materials.
Sure.
I don't know if you have that information available.
I don't, but the comparison is a little and a lot. I'll give you an example. A piece of terracotta the size of this garbage can, what would this weigh?
400 pounds.
400 pounds? If this was fiberglass, it'd be maybe 2 pounds more than what I'm lifting right now. If this was terracotta, I'd lift it the same way, but I'd be sweating. 400 pounds is nothing. No, but that's the difference. Yes?
What's the longevity of fiberglass? Is it something that's going to last 50 years, 100 years, or are you going to have to replace it in 25 years? Because it doesn't withstand the elements.
It does withstand the elements. Anecdotally, there have been boats, fiberglass boats, that have been in the water since the early 50s. So when
maintained, right?
some not.
And
But
how about the color quality of
let's
the
talk about two different things.
Yeah.
With almost every building material, there's two different things. There's the structural integrity and the appearance. The fiberglass is essentially, and I'm just talking about fiberglass because I happen to be in the fiberglass business, but the same thing pertains to sheet metal or cast iron or any of these things. But fiberglass in particular, it's an inert material. It's unaffected by the weather in a structural manner. It has if it's made properly, it has the exterior coating of it in the molded in surface of it is done in a durable, weather-resistant material. Depending on the color, because colors in paint, in fiberglass, and even sometimes in stone will change over time. You know, you'll see stone that's quarried and it looks one thing. You put it up on a building exposed to, and like reds and stuff, they'll change. So some colors are more prone to some shift in the color. But just like with sheet metal or wood or cast iron, they're intended to be painted. And so fiberglass, it's molded in its color. We have stuff that's been up on buildings now for 50 years.
Examples in New York?
Sure.
What's one or two examples I can think of easily?
We did, at the South Beach Psychiatric Hospital, we did about 5 miles of gutter cornice around the building in the mid-'60s.
South Beach is where?
Staten Island. Don't we all go there? It's a psychiatric hospital. It's home. Last time I went there, it was, yes.
Okay, in a lot of cases, as an architect, I have a wood furnace,
Mm-hmm.
but because of the expense can we ask landmarks to give it to you and let you mold it into metal? Will they allow that from time to time?
Yeah, we replicate wood all the time.
Particularly if it's rotted behind.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And then, but we have to show how that's being done, photographs of the existing, and then
Yes,
probably a detail from you exactly how it's going to be done.
yes. And see, that's the thing is that there are two aspects of something, what it's made of and what it looks like. And I think that, you know, I have all respect for the Landmarks Commission because I think that they do the right thing, but their emphasis should be what's it look like at the end of the day? Does it look like what it looked like originally? So if it was a wood cornice, which was a painted wood cornice, and you drive down the street and you look up at it, you don't say, oh, I see painted wood. You really see paint. You don't know that it's wood. Same thing with cast iron. You don't know that it's cast iron, and you don't know that it's tin, and in many cases you don't even know that it's terracotta, because if it's done properly with substitute materials, it look the same, and it will certainly last as long, if not longer, than your wood cornice would have if it was done in other materials. And if it's properly done, and I keep coming back to that because there are many examples of stuff that's not properly done, and it's not necessarily indicative of the whole industry.
Charlie, does it matter whether you're doing it on an upper floor, a high floor of a 6th floor tenement, or a 2-story row house? Does your approach change based on where the cornice or the detail is on the building?
That's a good question. Sorry about this. I'd say we've done some things at ground level. We've certainly done quite a lot of storefront cornices, which I think is a good, compelling application. So, the issue of things that people can physically access, they want to be able to knock on it and make it sound and feel like it's stone or some solid material, or in the instance that we did a proposal for a children's museum, and the architect asked me, what's the durability of the fiberglass? I said, well, what do you have in mind? He said, well, so the worst case condition is if we have a 14-year-old with a baseball bat, so we have maximum energy and minimum conscience. And so, yeah, somebody goes at it with a baseball bat, the bat will win. So, so for down, first floor applications, we have done some things, columns and so forth, but for cornices on lower floors, it's certainly a good application. The mounting technique would be perhaps different because for like a water table or intermediate cornice or other elements, they would be what we call face mounted or wall mounted, in which case, instead of this kind of an application, you have the wall and the cornice element would be pitched away from the building and in many cases attached onto treated wood blocking top and bottom. It would not require structures inside up to maybe a 2-foot projection. It can be wall mounted. The only thing that we sometimes recommend if it's a large cornice is perhaps that they'll put bird proofing to keep the snow from sliding off. But other than that, lower elements certainly not. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
If you were doing a project that was subject to, I don't know if the federal historic tax credits still exist, the new tax code, but if you were following Department of Interior standards, could you substitute
Yes.
a modern material for an old material and still comply with those
Part of
standards?
The Secretary of Interior's guidelines actually allow that. In fact, there's fiberglass on the White House. I don't know if that's.
In the president's hair, or?
It's actually,
Don't give it back.
Sorry.
We don't touch that.
I think, since this is a cornices, session,
Yeah.
I think it's, important because Jeff brought up the question of, different places in the building or higher, lower, that, the replacement material, the cornices has a little more leeway in the sense that, it's a more independent element and often can be reached more easily than, let's say, section, parts of the building that have an element here and here and here to be replaced. That when you're working with an integral wall of a material and you replace pieces randomly with another material, the materials respond differently to weather and so on, and that can become an issue. In this discussion of cornices, it's a little different because it's sort of an integral element in the building that's all of one piece, let's say fiberglass. So I think it's worth noting the difference, the context becomes very, very important in the placement.
Right, and I think that's an important thing, is that the context, it has to look appropriate. It has to, my favorite expression is that any material is not a mechanic in a can. It doesn't do everything. So that, infills, you have whether it's, no matter what the original material is, putting something else into the midst of it, especially with terracotta, that you have to be concerned about how it's going to look.
But also behave, right? Weathering
Yes,
and.
because it's not a cementitious mortar installation. It's a caulk joint, so that it does respond differently. And so it's all a question of what it is in the whole context of the building. One of the questions that often comes up is, how do you know when to repair and when to replace? That's a sticky question, and it really requires, a professional to look at it. A lot of times we're asked to repair parts of something, and when you look at the whole structure, the failure wasn't just on the one place on the building. It might have, the whole cornice or 3/4 of the cornice might have failed, and are you just going to repair that part? But yet some things are repairable. There are the majority of cornices in the city, I'd say, are mostly sheet metal. So, can sheet metal be repaired? Yes, as long as the underlying, as I said before, the underlying mode of failure is dealt with. One of the things that always amazes me is you drive along and you look at a 10 or 15-story building, and it has a beautiful sheet metal cornice. It has dents in it. It's like stove in, and it used to amaze me. How did that happen? And then one day I came by and I saw the repairman up there with the old C-hook on the cornice, and so it's like the light went off. That's because it looked like a truck backed into the 10th floor. It just didn't make sense. So that the repair procedures for the building were a function of the detriment to the building. In which case, what we do when we do projecting cornices, let's say this cornice is projecting out 4 feet into space, So we'll put provisions in the cornice for scaffold sleeves, so that when they go to do this repair of the building in the future, they'll have a, you know, proper pipe frame scaffold, and they'll run their wire to the hang scaffold below, and that way they don't have to disturb the cornice, because if they don't put scaffold sleeves into it, some guy 5 years from now is gonna come with a big drill. He's gonna drill a hole right through the cornice, and they're gonna shimmy the wire down, and you'll have a, you know, penetration and all kinds of common problems. So quite often we'll design in a scaffold sleeve, and what I always try to get them to do is to have a cap and a keeper, a little chain, so that when they take this off, they'll put the cap back on. Believe it or not, something on the 15th floor, this little pipe going through it, you know, might be an inch and a half height. You walk by and you'll see the sunlight coming through these little holes. It's amazing. So they have to, if you ever have this situation on your building where they're going to have a scaffold sleeve, make sure they have a cap on. So those kinds of attentions to those details are really important, because, you know, the question of scaffolding for the installation or in the future, how they're going to access this building, because every 5 years they have to do what we want to let them.
So these sleeves are in like fiberglass cornices?
Well, in my case, in fiberglass cornices.
So what I'm
sheet
wondering
metal
is,
cornices,
if you have a hanging scaffold with the, you know, ropes coming down, and people are, you know, pulling those scaffolds, you know, when they're on the ground or whatever, isn't it putting a lot of tension and force against the sleeves and potentially undoing the effort that you've put in to create a you know, something with structural
possibly, like
integrity?
if the wind comes along and blows this scaffold, which can happen, to blow it halfway across the street, it will put some pressure on here. But keep in mind that if this is a 4-foot cornice, and if they have their hanging wires out here, that means that the workmen can't get to the building.
No, I understand
So
what you're saying.
So they, if they do that, then they have to somehow pull themselves in, which puts another load elsewhere. This is actually a better way to do it. That is a possibility, but these tubes would be attached to the framing inside, so they're pretty robust.
What's the full name of your company again?
Arch Fiberglass Corporation. I have some cards that if you want, when we're done, and I can also, I have a little sort of a paper that I wrote about specifying and installing cornices, and it describes, you know, what some of the things that we touched upon in terms of the structure, the types of cornices there are, the details of fasteners and joints and materials and such, and a specification of materials which I could send to you.
Could you go back for a second
Sure.
to cost?
Cost.
I don't know that what you know about the cost, I don't, of different materials versus fiberglass.
Typically, the fiberglass is, the installed cost of fiberglass is, in most cases, quite attractive, especially when you're dealing with cementitious materials. Part of which is that that the cornice can be installed by you know, basically a carpenter. Lightweight frames that are attached onto fairly lightweight framing, so that it doesn't require the use of masons or steel workers or cranes and derricks. It can be brought up on a scaffold or carried up on the pipe scaffold and installed directly. But just the material sitting on the ground fiberglass is cost comparative to sheet metal or terracotta, it's considerably less expensive.
So there are actually two aspects of cost, and I think it's interesting that you pointed that out. One is the cost of the material and the manufacture of the individual unit or the set of units in the same mold. And then the other is the time and aspects of installation.
Right.
And you're thinking in both cases you're saving.
Yes, and the time frame, start to finish, in fiberglass, in most cases, is much quicker than getting something from. With terracotta, the big players are Boston Valley up in the Buffalo area and Vladimir Bean in California, and they do really excellent work, and because of that, they're usually booked, so that getting stuff is not,
There's lead time issues, depending a little bit on the job, the season, and so on.
Yeah, there's a sign that sort of says, your lack of planning does not constitute
An emergency on my part.
So our people will call up and they say they want something ASAP, and I ask them, well, what does that mean, ASAP? They say, oh, that's as soon as possible. I said, no, that ASAP stands for after September, April possibly. So that's a big issue because sometimes your budget and your inclination may be such that you could afford a more costly material, but yet that downstairs commercial tenant is not going to want to spend the next 7 or 8 months with a scaffold in front of his window. We're on 86th Street and on Amsterdam Avenue and 85th Street. There's been a building that has had a scaffold on it now for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, and the commercial tenants. I mean, you got to be nuts to go in that building. People have been in that building and go out. If somebody comes in, the last 6 months they can't do it because there's a scaffold there. So that the pressure from commercial tenants quite often is such that you've got to get in, you've got to get it done, you've got to get gone. And if landmarks, now the flip side is that you go to landmarks and you say, well, I got this pressure of time, not their issue. You say, well, it's costly, not their issue. They don't care, and nor should they really, that something is going to be expensive or it's going to take a long time, because they are the keepers of the flame, the guardians of the temple. And but within reason, I think that it would be nice if they did have some response to time and money. So we talked about permits, we talked about installation rigging. In looking at a building, that's always an important cost element, is what kind of rigging. Fiberglass on low-story buildings, 2- or 3-story buildings, could be installed from a cherry picker, lift, so that they may be able to not have to put up a bridge and a scaffold and all that stuff. There are, I could go into different types of cornices and styles.
Can I ask,
Sure.
what percentage of your work is on landmark buildings versus not?
I'd say over the years, maybe a quarter. We probably put up.
So then the rest of those buildings, the 3/4 are really the rest of the city, the buildings that make up either the background buildings or other important buildings that haven't been recognized by the commission. And I think that's an interesting aspect because the city has a very small percentage of landmark and historic district buildings, really. I think it's 5%.
But in our case, as a repair material, restoration material, the people who are in landmark districts are, have an impetus to do the restoration of their original appearance. And our motto, my motto, is in my business, even though my wife tells me it's poor English, but my feeling is it's just as easy to do it right as it is to do it different. Which means that people will say, well, what do you got that's, it's better that we should make the cornice fit the building rather than make the building fit some cornice I happen to have. I got 300 molds of cornices, and sometimes we're able to adaptively reuse existing mold, which saves a considerable amount of money, but it really has to be done right, it has to look right, which is, yes.
I know this is all about parapets, cornices, that sort of thing, but it seems like, and tell me, can this be used for other decorative elements, that are very hard to find that you may have to replicate or something?
We're doing, we're doing a job now that we're replicating balconies, balconettes, things like that.
Even figurines or
Figurines,
something that's,
we're doing, I got a call just the other day for some gargoyles on a building on Irving Place. And it turns out that we made gargoyles for that building 20 years ago and have the mold for it. But yeah, we've done gargoyles. We did a big griffin on the Marriott East Side, on the 30-some odd floor. So yeah, we've done cartouches and gargoyles and gewgaws and all kinds of things. Yes.
One of the things that being in the landmarks district is very much involved. A lot of people let the cornice that's damaged just be taken down. And you see it all over the city, particularly in the landmarks districts. But we at Pratt have been very carefully analyzing the fact that if you put your cornice back up, it increases the real estate value. Just as if you repair the facade of your building in the landmarks building, even though you want to do a totally abstract modern interior, you got everything, take all the plastic detail down, still by having the cornice and the exterior facade brought back to the original as close as you can get it, it increases the real estate value.
Wow, a lot.
And a lot of people don't believe that, and they need to be convinced.
Okay, we have time for one question, and then we have another session.
Somebody else have a question? That's one of the things that a word that I like is appropriate. That you have to do something that's appropriate in style, size, scale, and scope. And so, you get a building and they want to put something in that's it seems like it's cost effective, which is another word, cheap. But you can't put a little hat on a big head or a big hat on a little head. So it's got to look right. And it's got to pass that sniff test of when you drive by, how's the curb appeal of it? Does it look right? Does it look appropriate? And that's it's not just sort of a pie in the sky question. I think it's a real thing. And that's why I encourage people to get that archival photo of their building from the 40s to see what it looked like before it was stepped on and stripped. And then do something that's going to, if not exactly, copy the original, but at least make it emulate. Like that's one of the words I use. It's kind of a little word. I say that it will be emulative of the original. So that you end up with something that's going to look right. Are there any other questions before we go?
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening.